Thank you. Welcome to a biology lesson where we are going to share biology from 1 topic 5, where we discuss living things and their environment. We are going to share classification of living things in this lesson. You are with me, George Chapusa. Stay there and pay attention. Now, we are going to look into classification of these living things. So there is a wide variety of plants and animals living in the natural habitat on Earth, and this great variety of living organisms is called biodiversity. So due to the great diversity, it is not easy to identify and study all living organisms individually, which means we're supposed to study them in groups. However, when putting in groups according to some common criteria, it becomes easier to study them. So this is more and more important as we wish to classify living things. So if they are put into groups is when it becomes more easier to study them. So we just started sharing the classification, but we didn't share the definition of the word classification. Now let us have the definition of the word classification. The process of grouping organisms based on their similarities, differences, feeding methods, or habitats is called classification. So which means we are going to group animals according or based on their similarities, differences, feeding methods, or habitat. And that is called a classification. So before we continue on grouping organisms based on their similarities, differences, feeding methods, or habitats, let us look at the importance of classifying living things. So importance of classification. One of the importance is that classification is necessary because when living things are divided into smaller groups whose members have common characteristics, it becomes easier to study them. Then two, classification makes it easier to identify relationships between groups of organisms. For instance, you may be assisted to have this type of a group properly if you have the classification, because we have said classification makes it easier to identify relationships between groups of organisms. For instance, are a batch closely related to birds because both of them have wings? That could come to you as a question. Are whales closely related to fish because they both swim in the sea? For such kind of questions, this classification might help you to group these animals into smaller groups so that you easily identify them. And you may find solutions to such kind of questions if you happen to classify them. So, are whales batch closely related to each other than to either birds or fish? These kind of questions still remain there without answers. So organisms that have more common characteristics are more closely related. So this shows that they may have a common origin. Of course, that is normally called evolutionary relationship. So such kind of questions can remain or can be removed if you happen to classify these animals according to their similarities, differences, the feeding methods, or habitats. So that's why we come with this lesson, so that we group these animals according to such kind of classification. So classification helps to organize all types of non-organisms in order to make it easier to find information about them. So to provide a coherent and universal system of grouping organisms is where now we wish to arrange living things into smaller groups. Or now we are going to look on how we might arrange those living things into groups. So living things can be grouped according to the following. 1, similarity and differences, and B could be habitats. Then lastly, there could be feeding methods. feeding methods. Like we have already shared, our main focus is to be classifying these animals into a smaller group. So let us start arranging these living things into groups according to their similarities. So grouping living things according to their similarities. Grouping living things according to their similarities. Organisms like insects are similar because all have 3 body parts: wings, abdomen, and the 3 pairs of legs. Wings, the abdomen, and the 3 pairs of legs. So that brings a similarity between the insects. So that can help us to put all insects with this kind of characters into the group of insects. So other organisms like the large animals have mammary glands to feed their young ones. Also, this is helping big or large animals to have one similarity which brings them together. Then other organisms like birds are similar because they all have wings, feathers, and beak. Right? So this also could bring birds together, as these birds, they have similar characteristics or similar things which might bring them into one group. So as we are grouping living things according to their similarities, here we have a similar example which might help you to understand more about this grouping according to their similarities. So here we have animals according to their similarities. These animals, all of these animals have mammary glands. You may identify these animals, these as antelopes, then we have the giraffes here, then the zebra. All these, they have mammary glands, which means their young ones are able to benefit milk through the mammary glands. Then we might also group living things according to their differences. What makes them differ can make them also have different kind of groups. So grouping living things according to their differences. So similar things can be grouped according to differences. For example, birds can be grouped according to ability to fly and whether the bird is domestic or wild. Some other birds can be domestic while others are wild birds. So those could be issues to bring their differences. So here we still have other organisms which can be grouped according to the body appearance, like human beings, dogs, cats, goats, sheep, cows, among others. All these can also be grouped according to their differences. Despite all of them can be regarded as animals with mammary glands, but they might also have other differences which can be seen from there. So the table below shows grouping of birds according to their differences. All of us, we might understand that birds can still have differences despite they all have wings, they all have feathers, they all have beaks. Now, let us look at the notable differences that we might see from these birds from this table. So here we have a table of birds, 3 types of these birds. Then you may note their differences. Now the first type of a bird, they have red beaks. They have red beaks, whereby this second bird has a blue tail, while the last bird shown here has the red corpse. So all these mentioned parts brings the differences according to these birds. So birds, of course, can also be grouped according to their differences. Now, let us switch our mind where we are going to look on grouping living things according to their habitats. There are so many habitats where these animals or living things might survive. So a habitat is a place where a living thing lives. Some organisms live in marine water, while others might live in fresh water, and some on land and others under the soil. So amongst these habitats, you'll find that you can group living things according to this kind of the mentioned habitats. Despite some might also have different habitats apart from the mentioned habitats. So living things can therefore be grouped according to where they live, that is the habitat. For example, moles and mice live under the soil. Mice, they live under the soil, that is their habitat. So you might group them according to the way how they live, that is under the soil. Now, most wild animals live on trees. You might group all animals living on trees as animals living under one habitat. So this is helping us to have more knowledge on how we might group living things according to their environment. So organisms living in the same habitat can therefore be grouped together. That can be grouped together. So here we have a table of different animals living in different habitats. The table showing different animals living in different habitats. Yeah, so here we have the table of animals with their habitat. A table of animals living in different habitats. Here we may have a bird which has a habitat which is trees. And here we have the crab which might live in water. And then we have fish which lives in fresh water. And here we have these moles under the soils. So this could be how living things can be grouped according to their differences in habitats. As we continue, let us look at grouping living things according to their feeding methods. Grouping living things according to their feeding methods. These living things can be grouped according to their feeding methods because different animals feed differently. Different organisms have different feeding methods. For example, we may have carnivores. These are animals which feed on flesh only, or these are animals which feed on other animals only. They include lions, tigers, leopards, just to mention a few. You may add more examples as far as you discover animals which might feed on flesh only. I may add one from there, like hyenas also might be under the same group of carnivores. And then we may have herbivores. These are animals which feed on plants only. They never feed on other animals, they feed only on plants, which means any type of vegetation becomes a part of their feed. So if they happen to find food, this becomes only the plants only. So this might include the zebra, cow, rabbits, goats. You may continue by adding sheep, such kind of animals. Then lastly, we may have the omnivores. These are animals which feed on both flesh and plants. These are animals which feed on both flesh and plants. I've already explained about the word flesh. This could mean other animals and plants. For example, we may have a man. You are also an example of an omnivore because you are able to feed on animals and plants. So that is the groups according to feeding methods. And we continue by saying living things can therefore be grouped according to each feeding method. For example, all carnivores can be grouped together. So that is what we have just explained there. Now this table helping us to understand more about the grouping of these living things according to their feeding habits. So these animals are just examples of animals which are carnivores. And their feeding habits is where they feed on other animals. You might see here there is a diagram of lions. They are feeding on a prey, which could be another animal. And here we have herbivores, which is more like a diagram of a rabbit and a zebra. All these, they depend on plants only. Then this is a diagram of a human being and is an example of omnivores. Yeah, so this could be the ways we may discuss on how we might group animals according to their differences, similarities, habitats, and their feeding habits. Now, let us continue by looking at the identification of living things. These living things can be identified. These living things can be identified even if you don't know the type or the name of that living thing, but still more, you might identify them. So there is a way of identifying these living things by using a dichotomous key. A dichotomous key. So biologists use a similar way to identify unknown living organisms according to certain characteristics. Like what we have just shared here, we have just shared some similarities, some differences and feeding habits, and again we have shared their habitats. So biologists, they also happen to study living things which they have never seen them, but they can still identify them by using the dichotomous key. So biologists use a similar way to identify unknown living organisms according to certain characteristics using a set of instructions that we call a dichotomous key. So the term dichotomous, of course, comes from the word dichotomy, and which means divided into two parts. So a dichotomous key is a set of instructions used to identify unknown organisms by using descriptions to or of observable features. So this dichotomous key is a well-known method that biologists use, and they happen to identify a lot of unknown organisms in the environment. So this is also an interesting area where we also need to understand, as biologists, we need to know how to use this dichotomous key. So next time we meet, we shall discuss on how we might use a dichotomous key to identify organism, using a dichotomous key to identify organism. And that has been your biology teacher, George Chakusa. Thank you for being a very good listener. Thank you. Until we meet the other time.